Hello everyone and welcome back to the program. Today I want to tell you about an exciting development for God's work. On Sunday, June 10th, we open the doors to a world premiere exhibit on the campus of Herbert W. Armstrong College in Edmond, Oklahoma. Seals of Isaiah the Prophet and King Hezekiah Discovered is an archaeological exhibition that will enable visitors to discover the history of ancient Judah's most famous king-prophet pairing. A story which illuminates how Jerusalem was miraculously saved from annihilation at the hands of King Sennacherib's Assyrian army at the end of the 8th century BC. The items on display at our exhibit include nearly 36 artifacts from the time of King Hezekiah, including the recently discovered royal seal impressions of King Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah. On today's program, I want to tell you just a little bit about this world premiere exhibit and why we're so excited about it.
The Trumpet Daily.
This year marks the 50th anniversary of our partnership with the highly esteemed MAZAR family in Jerusalem. Back in 1967, following Israel's victory in the Six-Day War, Dr. Benjamin MAZAR was given charge of a massive archaeological dig just south of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The following year, in September 1968, American educator and theologian Herbert W. Armstrong, he sent a few Ambassador College officials to meet with Benjamin MAZAR in Jerusalem. And during that visit, Professor MAZAR told the AC officials about his upcoming excavation, and he said it would be one of the most significant digs ever undertaken in Jerusalem. Less than a month after that initial meeting, Mr. Armstrong himself flew to Jerusalem to meet Dr. Benjamin MAZAR for the first time. And this was the beginning of a long and endearing relationship between Mr. Armstrong and Professor MAZAR. It was on December 1st, 1968, at the presidential residence in Jerusalem, during a meeting between Mr. Armstrong and Professor MAZAR and also the President of Israel, that the Israeli tourism minister proposed an iron bridge. That kind of a strong partnership between Hebrew University and Ambassador College, Mr. Armstrong's college in Pasadena, California. This was a partnership that would never be broken, that Minister of Tourism said. Mr. Armstrong later marveled at the tremendous favor that he received while in Israel. He said it was inspiring, astonishing, and most unusual. Now, between 1968 and 1986, Mr. Armstrong sent Ambassador College students to Jerusalem every summer to work at Benjamin MAZAR's excavations. And during that same time, Mr. Armstrong himself visited Israel more than 50 times. He was close friends with many of the nation's top leaders. He met with every prime minister and president of Israel who held office over that period, including Golda Meir, Yitzhak Rabin, Menachem Begin, and Shimon Peres. And he had an especially close relationship with the Jerusalem mayor at the time, Teddy Kollek. You can read about a lot of this in this booklet, Ambassador for World Peace. Now, this is not just about his relationship with Israel, but if you know anything about Herbert Armstrong's work, he traveled right around the world, all over the place, meeting with kings and presidents and prime ministers all over the world. But he, as I say, though, he had a very special relationship with the leaders of Israel between 1968 and 1986, the year that he died. And of course, his closest relationships in Israel, that would be, as I mentioned, the Jerusalem mayor, but then also Benjamin MAZAR, the archaeologist. In fact, when Mr. Armstrong died in January of 1986, Professor MAZAR wrote to Mr. Armstrong's church, and he said this: "During the years of our association with him, all of us developed the highest regard for his wonderful personality and qualities." This is Professor MAZAR talking about Mr. Armstrong. It says, his deep devotion to the ideals of peace and justice in the spirit of the biblical prophets was appreciated by his friends in Israel. Professor MAZAR said his feeling for Israel and Jerusalem was manifested in his true interest in the archaeological excavations near the Temple Mount and in the city of David. His name will always be attached to this most important undertaking carried out in Jerusalem. And indeed, you can see evidence of Mr. Armstrong's name in Jerusalem to this day. Now, you could also say many of those same things about Benjamin MAZAR, who died 9 years later. He died in 1995. And a lot of his work, a lot of his legacy, it was left to his granddaughter, Dr. MAZAR's granddaughter, Elot. She's the one that followed in his footsteps all through the 90s, on into the 2000s. And it was in August of 2006 that the Armstrong-MAZAR partnership, this iron bridge, it was in 2006 that that relationship was restored. That was the year that we contacted Elot MAZAR to discuss this iron bridge relationship that we had had going back to the days of Herbert Armstrong. And she remembered it well from the days of her youth. She was a little girl, a teenager, working out on the digs with her grandfather alongside the AC students back in the 1960s and the 1970s. Now, as it happened, when we contacted her in 2006, she was set to begin another phase of excavating there at the palace of King David in the city of David, there in Jerusalem. And so she invited our students from Herbert W. Armstrong College, to join her on the dig. And we eagerly accepted the invitation. Since 2006, we've sent more than, I think, 57 diggers or excavators or volunteers to Jerusalem to work on Dr. MAZAR's excavations. Our students comprised most of the laborers on Dr. MAZAR's most recent dig, this one that we had just recently in the spring of 2018, and that was also the excavation that we fully funded. Over the past 12 years, Herbert W. Armstrong College has participated in every one of Dr. MAZAR's excavations in the city of David and on the Ophel. And during this time, Dr. MAZAR has discovered some of the most stunning and important artifacts ever uncovered anywhere in the world. She's unearthed evidence of the palace of King David, as I mentioned a moment ago, and also King Solomon's royal quarters, the governor Nehemiah's wall, he too mentioned in the Bible, the seals of two Judean princes mentioned in Jeremiah 37. We had an exhibit featuring those clay seals back in 2011 at Armstrong Auditorium. But carrying on with all of these magnificent finds, more recently she discovered the golden menorah, the medallion that is, then the stash of bronze coins. It's really a remarkable record. And now we come to the seals, the clay seals of King Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah. These two on display together for the first time at Armstrong Auditorium in Edmond, Oklahoma. That'll be during the summer of 2018, and if those two clay seals are the stars of our exhibit, the supporting cast is also impressive. In addition to the clay seals, we also have about 36 artifacts from the time of King Hezekiah, including royal Judean vessels and weapons used during the siege of Lachish. The exhibit will also feature various Assyrian inscriptions and replicas of the famous Assyrian wall reliefs. And visitors are also going to be able to walk through a 9-foot replica of Hezekiah's underground water tunnel in Jerusalem. That'll be on display as well, that replica. So we're pretty excited about all of these developments. And we'll play the trailer advertising this exhibit here in just a second. And after that, I'll come back and talk about some of the press or some of the coverage we've received in Jerusalem, really all around the world, but in Jerusalem in particular. But first, let me just play you this 2-minute trailer that advertises the upcoming exhibit at Armstrong Auditorium. seals of King Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah. That's the trailer for our exhibit at Armstrong Auditorium. Now, some of you who are familiar with our work may remember the exhibit back in 2011, Jeremiah's Captors. And that exhibit featured 2 clay seals as well, but they're basically obscure members of the Judean court mentioned there in Jeremiah 37. I mean, certainly it's significant, and we said it was significant back in 2011 because they're mentioned in the Bible. But along comes Hezekiah, the king of Judah, and then together with him, this king-prophet relationship. Pretty amazing. Now, I know many of you watching this probably won't have a chance to visit the exhibit, although some of you seeing the video in the U.S. might be able to see it sometime this summer. I'll be going over there with my family in August to see the exhibit, and also the musical on this same story, Isaiah the prophet, that will be playing on August the 12th. But lots to be excited about. But before I get ahead of myself, just to focus again on June 10th, the grand opening of this exhibit, we've got a reception planned at the exhibit location in Edmond, Oklahoma, and also in Jerusalem at the King David Hotel. So we're very excited about streaming these 2 events together in both directions so that the people in Edmond can see what's going on in Jerusalem and vice versa. On May 28th, 2018, the Jerusalem Post featured this exhibit and the forthcoming receptions, both in Jerusalem and in Edmond, and it gave us some really nice coverage on the front page of its website. It was on page 7 of its print edition of the Jerusalem Post, talking about this joint reception, or this joint revelation of these 2 clay seals. And let me just read to you what the Jerusalem Post had to say. This is, again, May 28th. It says, while the seals and nearly 36 other pieces loaned by the Antiquities Authority will be on display in Oklahoma, the archaeologist who made the discoveries, that's Eilat Mazar, will deliver a keynote address in Jerusalem. The connection, it says, the connection between Oklahoma and the Antiquities collection lies with the relationship between Hebrew University of Jerusalem's biblical archaeologist, Dr. Eilat Mazar, and the Armstrong International Cultural Foundation, that's our church's foundation, whose main cultural center, the Armstrong Auditorium, is based in Edmond, Oklahoma. Then the article goes on and talks about some of the history I mentioned at the top of the show. This relationship between the Armstrongs and the MAZARs going back to 1968, and how that Mr. Armstrong sent his students over to work with Dr. Benjamin Mazar during the 1960s and the 70s and the 80s. And then it talks about the relationship today and how that Herbert W. Armstrong College sends students and volunteers to assist at Dr. Eilat Mazar's digs. Let me just read to you what the curator of the exhibit, Brad McDonald, he's actually quoted in this Jerusalem Post piece as saying, this is truly a historic exhibition. Artifacts from the Assyrian siege of Jerusalem have been exhibited previously, but these exhibits have never included the seals of King Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah. Visitors would have to travel to London, Jerusalem, Istanbul, and Chicago to see everything on display. Here, we've brought them all together in one place. I mean, that's pretty amazing. Some of you have probably visited the British Museum. I've been there several times. I've been to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And here we have an exhibit that's bringing all of these artifacts together, that you'd have to travel right around the world to 4 different museums to see them all. It's pretty amazing. You can see why we're pretty excited about this summer exhibit at Armstrong Auditorium in Edmond, Oklahoma. Well, let me just refer you to some of the literature that we'd like to offer you today. Free of charge, no cost or follow-up. This one I mentioned, Ambassador for World Peace, a great little summary of Herbert Armstrong's work and how far-reaching it was, and how many world leaders he met with, and how many international projects he had and sponsored all over the world. Pretty amazing story. And also, of course, we're talking about Isaiah the prophet and King Hezekiah. Well, here's our booklet on Isaiah's book, the message of Isaiah the prophet. Make sure that you request this if you don't have it already, and we'll send you a free copy. And then this reprint article, The Significance of the Hezekiah Bulla. This was produced a couple of years ago in our literature. I think this first came out in the news maybe in 2016. This is an article by my father. We can send you a free copy of that. And then more recently, of course, we talked about the recent revelation of the Isaiah Bulla. Both of them. We've had a lot to say about them over the last 2 or 3 years. And of course, it's these two clay seals that will be showcased together in Edmond, Oklahoma. Stay tuned and request the free material during the break. We'll be right back.
The Trumpet Daily.
Dr. Eilat Mazar recently gave me a copy of her book, The Ophel Excavations, basically the research as it's all been brought together. We can't offer this freely, unfortunately. But in this book, she has a little chapter in there about this special relationship between Hezekiah, King Hezekiah, and the prophet Isaiah. Here's a quote from it. It says, "Under Hezekiah's rule, Judah became a center for all the people of Israel, including the inhabitants of the former kingdom of Israel. And the temple in Jerusalem played a major role as the holiest place for all." I mean, this was a remarkable king. You can look at 2 Kings 18 and verse 5. It says, "There was none like Hezekiah among all the kings of Judah." That's pretty special. God really has a high opinion of this Judean king. Let me just take you to a verse in 2 Chronicles. This is chapter 29 and verse 2. It says, "And he did that which was right in the sight of the Eternal, according to all that David," that's King David, "all that David his father had done." See, that was the key to his greatness. Hezekiah, he looked back to King David, a man who had a heart like God's, it says in Acts 13. Now, in recent months, we've been talking about this special connection, this king-prophet pairing, and there's no question that the relationship between Hezekiah and Isaiah is very special. But you could also, even though he didn't live at that time, you could also bring David into it as well because of what this verse says right here. I mean, David, the example that David set is what kept Hezekiah on track. And then you bring into that this great prophet of God. Let's just look at the beginning of the book of Isaiah. This is Isaiah chapter 1. Looking at the first couple of verses, it says, "The vision of Isaiah the son of Amoz, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah," it says there, kings of Judah, all of them. It says, "Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, or the Eternal has spoken. I have nourished and brought up children," it says, "and they have rebelled against me." So it lists all these kings. Isaiah was alive during portions of the reigns of 5 different kings. Manasseh as well. He's mentioned, or not mentioned in that passage, but he too, at the end of it all. I mean, it gives you some, the time frame. Judah, the history of Judah, it went through the span of some 20 kings. And the 10th one's mentioned here along with the 14th. And so that gives you some time frame there. Isaiah lived from about 775 to 687 BC. He had a fairly long life, and he prophesied for God. And let me just show you what it says over in Isaiah chapter 30, just to conclude here, to bring it to our time today. I mean, why is this relevant? Why should we be excited about this history? Well, look at what the Bible says. Look at what these great, towering personalities, look at what they wrote. Let me just give you a quote from, again, this is our brochure that we've produced for the exhibit. And it says here, I just mentioned King David, his legacy, his example. Then you have this great king of Judah, none like him in Judah's history. Then this great prophet of God. And about this prophet, we write here in our brochure, Isaiah most likely lived with his family inside the royal complex on the Ophel in Jerusalem. He was an official historian to Judah's kings. Isaiah was married to a prophetess. You can see that in the 8th chapter of Isaiah. It says, and together they had at least 2 sons. According to Jewish tradition, Isaiah also had a daughter, Hephzibah. And the brochure goes on and points out that this, according to Jewish tradition, This woman was evidently married to King Hezekiah. I mean, these are towering personalities of the Bible. Kings, prophets, prophetesses. Pretty amazing. But now look at the message. Look at Isaiah 30 in verse 8. It says, "Now go, write it before them in a table, and note it in a book, that it may be for the time to come, forever and ever." God said to this prophet, you put these prophecies I'm giving to you, you put it in a book so that it will be preserved, so that it will be there for a time to come. And the beautiful thing, Isaiah is a fairly long book, but taken together, all 66 chapters, in some ways it's like a miniature Bible. It's quoted dozens of times in the New Testament. Jesus quoted from it. I mean, he came back from the titanic struggle against Satan the devil and started to preach. And you can see this in Luke chapter 4. And he opened the Bible to the book of Isaiah and started to teach right from that book. Christ quotes from the prophet Isaiah several times during his ministry. Let me take you back to our brochure. It says, many of Isaiah's prophecies focused on a future millennial world in which war would cease, the dead would be raised, wild animals would become tame, and the Messiah would rule over all mankind. I mean, we get excited about the history. That's why we have these exhibits. That's why we're putting all these artifacts on display. But what about the message? What about the prophecies? Look at what's discussed in this wonderful book. So much more can be studied in this little booklet, Isaiah's End Time Vision. Make sure that you contact our operators today and order that, all the other material I've mentioned here today, including the Trumpet magazine. Subscribe to our monthly print edition of the Philadelphia Trumpet. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.